I have claimed that the long 20th century was the first century in which the most important historical thread was what we call the economic. And that's definitely a claim worth pausing over. The century saw, among much else, two world wars, the Holocaust, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the zenith of American influence, and the standing up and return to China's traditional place in the world of communist China. How dare I say that these are all aspects of one primarily economic story? Indeed, how dare I say that there is one single consequential thread? The reason I dare to claim this, of course, is the table above my right shoulder. The pace of growth of technology, which moves from being absolutely glacial before 1500 to not enough to matter until 1770 to 1870, or not enough to matter over any one person's life. But even in 1770 to 1870, fertility more or less keeps pace with technology. We do not see substantial increases in human standards of living, as higher populations mean greater resource scarcity, which more or less offsets the benefits of coal and steam and railroads and textile machinery. It is only after 1870 that we have our truly big watershed crossing, and I do want to claim that that makes the history of the long 20th century consequential, and that that's the most consequential part of it. That over 1870 to 2012, human technological capabilities multiply by 21.5-fold, our population multiplies 6-fold, and our prosperity is amplified 9-fold. That is accomplished through a process of extraordinary creative destruction that overturns society every generation, and that is the main thread to stick to in analyzing the history of the 20th century. That is my grand narrative. Now, how do I dare tell this grand narrative? I do so because we really have to tell grand narratives if we are to think at all. Grand narratives are, in the words of that bellwether 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, they are nonsense. But in a sense, all human thought is nonsense. All human thought is fuzzy, is prone to confusions, and capable of leading us vastly astray. But our fuzzy thoughts are the only way we can think, the only ways we have to progress. And if we are lucky, Wittgenstein says, we can recognize our thoughts as nonsensical, and yet use our ideas as steps, quote, to climb beyond them, and then throw away the ladder, unquote. For perhaps we will have learned to transcend propositions and gain the ability, quote, to see the world aright, unquote. So that's what I'm trying to do, and that's how I dare to declare unhesitatingly that the most consequential thread through all this history was economic. Before 1870, over and over again, technology had lost its race with human fecundity. Greater numbers, coupled with resource scarcity and a slow pace of technological innovation, produced a situation in which most people, most of the time, could not be confident that in a year they and their family would have enough to eat and the roof over their heads. Before 1870, those able to attain such comforts did so by taking from others, rather than by finding ways to make everyone more productive. Especially because specializing in producing rather than taking, those who do so thereby become very soft and attractive targets to those who specialize in taking. Now, the ice was breaking before 1870. Between 1770 and 1870, technology and organization gained a step or two, but only a step or two. In the early 1870s, that British economist, moral philosopher, and bureaucrat John Stuart Mill, the leader of what we call modern liberalism, claimed with justification Quote, "It is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toll of any human being. You have to go beyond 1870, a generation beyond, to see that material progress as unquestionable. Tell anyone from back before the long 20th century about the wealth, productivity, technology, and sophisticated productive organizations that the world today has and has built since 1870, and they would almost surely say that with such power and wealth in our collective hands, we surely must have built the world into a utopia. Or at least that's what they would want to say to us. And yet the world has really not been anything like a utopia in the long 20th century. Not at all. There has been enormous progress, but there has also been a dialogue, if you want to call it that politely, a dialogue between property rights on the one hand and rights to community income and employment security on the other, that has kept us very much from seeing ourselves as attaining some kind of utopia. And this is strong contraindication to how people looked things back in the first generation of 1870, back before they saw the possibility of technology advancing fast enough to win its race against human fecundity and resource scarcity. Perhaps the third best-selling novel in the United States in the late 1800s was Looking Backward, 2000 by 1887, by Edward Bellamy. It is a bad novel. Bellamy was a populist, and although he rejected the name, a socialist. He dreamed of a utopia created by government ownership of industry, by the elimination of destructive competition, by the altruistic mobilization of human energies. Technological and organizational abundance, he said, would then bring a society of abundance. He called his novel, therefore, a literary fantasy, a fairy tale of social felicity, in which he imagined a cloud palace for an ideal humanity. Via an unconvincing plot device, Bellamy throws his narrator protagonist forward in time from 1877 to 2000 to marvel at a well-working, rich utopian society. And at one point, the narrator protagonist is asked if he would like to hear some music. And he expects his hostess to play the piano. For everyone to be able to play music in their homes, that would itself be a vast leap forward. To listen to music on demand around 1900, you had to have in your house or nearby an instrument and someone trained to play it. That would have cost the average worker roughly a year at a 50-hour work week to earn the money to buy a high-quality piano. Then there would be the expense and the time committed to piano lessons. That this would be for everyone rather than for an upper class, that would have been a big deal. But Bellamy's protagonist is awed when his hostess does not sit down at the pianoforte to amuse him. Instead, she, quote, merely touched one or two screws, and immediately the room was filled with music, filled, not flooded, for by some means the volume of melody had been perfectly graduated to the size of the apartment. He learns that his hostess has dialed up on her telephone landline a live orchestra and has put it on the speakerphone. In Bellamy's Utopia, you see, you can dial up a local orchestra and listen to it play live. But wait, Bellamy added another wrinkle to make it even more impressive. He has a choice. He learns his hostess could have dialed up one of 4 orchestras currently playing. The narrator's reaction? The narrator's reaction was, if we in the 1800s could have devised an arrangement for providing everyone with music in their homes, perfect in quality, unlimited in quantity, suited to every mood, and beginning and ceasing at will, we should have considered the limit of human felicity already attained. The limit of human felicity. The consequences of the long 20th century have been enormous. Today, less than 9% of humanity lives at or below the roughly $2 a day living standard that we think of as extreme poverty today. That number is down from approximately 70% in 1870 and perhaps 85% in 1500 and earlier. And even among those 9%, many have access to public health and mobile phone communications technologies of vast worth and power. Today, the luckier economies of the world have attained levels of per capita prosperity at least 20 times those of 1870. And there is every reason to believe that they will continue to grow at an exponential rate in the centuries to come. Today, the typical citizens of those economies can wield powers of mobility, of communication, of creation, and indeed of destruction that approach those attributed to sorcerers and gods in ages past. And even the unlucky in the world today, even the majority of those living in the unlucky economies of the global south, they are very rich compared to the pre-industrial world. They confront not the $2 to $3 a day average living standard of those economies in 1800 or 1870, but the global south averages closer to $15 a day. Many technological inventions of the past century have transformed experiences that were rare and valued luxuries, available only to a rich few at great expense, into features of modern life that we take so much for granted we do not even think about them. For the first time in human history, there really is more than enough. Yet we today rarely see ourselves as extraordinarily lucky and fortunate that there are more than enough calories produced in the world, that it is not necessary that anybody need be hungry because there isn't enough to go around. There is more than enough shelter on the globe, that it is not necessary that anybody need to be wet and homeless because there is more than enough to go around. There is more than enough clothing in our warehouses, that it is not necessary that everybody need to be cold because there is more than enough going around. In short, we are no longer in anything that you might call the realm of necessity. German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel said, "Seek food and clothing first, and the kingdom of God will be added to you." So one would think we humans ought to be in something recognizably utopian. And that we cannot accept this is another consequences of living our lives fully in the stream of economic history. Utopias are all or nothing. Economic history's successes or failures are most often experienced at the margins. We want a little bit more, which is one of the reasons why no full-throated triumphalism over the last 20th century can survive even a brief look at our current situation today. We'll take a look at the political economy of the 2010s, take a look at the rise in North America and Europe and elsewhere of political movements that reject democratic representative consensus politics, movements that former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has called fascist. And who am I, for she grew up under fascism, to tell him that she is wrong? Indeed, triumphalist narratives collapse in the face of the conspicuous failures over the last decade by the stewards of the global economy. Yes, between 1870 and 2010, technology and organization repeatedly lapped and relapped and re-relapped fecundity. Yes, a newly rich humanity resoundingly triumphed over tendencies for population to expand and so greater resource scarcity to offset more knowledge and better technology. But material prosperity is very unevenly distributed around the globe to a gross, even criminal extent. And, material wealth does not make people happy in a world where politicians and others prosper mightily from finding new ways and using old ways to make people unhappy. The history of the long 20th century, it can't be told as a triumphal gallop or even a march or even a walk of progress. Slouch at best. And one reason is that so much of it has been and still is mediated by the market economy, by that mammon of unrighteousness. On the one hand, it enables the astonishing coordination of cooperation of now nearly 8 billion of us in a highly, highly productive division of labor. On the other hand, the market economy also recognizes no rights of humans other than the rights that come with the property their governments say they possess. And those property rights are worth something only if they help produce things that the rich kind of want to buy. That cannot be just. And as I noted before, there are two ways to deal with the fact that the market economy is a mammon of unrighteousness. Friedrich von Hayek always cautioned against listening to the siren song of social justice, that we should do better, that we needed to bind ourselves to the market and to recognize that interference in the market would send us into a downward spiral. It would put us on a road to, well, as the title of Hayek's best-known book is, The Road to Serfdom. Karl responded that such an attitude was inhuman and impossible, that people firmly believed, above all else, that they had other rights more important than and prior to the property rights that energized the market economy. Rights to the community that gave them support, to an income that gave them the resources they deserved, to stability that gave them consistent work. And should the market economy try to dissolve all rights other than property rights? Well, watch out. Slouching, however, is much better than standing still, let alone going backward. Humans have always been inventive. Technological advance has rarely stopped. Dark ages like those that happened at the end of the Bronze Age or after the fall of the Roman Empire are rare. Yet, for much of history, it did not seem to make much difference for the typical. The windmills, dikes, fields, crops, and animals of Holland in 1700 made the economy of its countryside very, very different indeed than the thinly farmed marshes of 700 or so. The ships that docked at the Chinese port of Canton had much greater range, and the commodities loaded on and off them had much greater value in 1700 than in 700. And both commerce and agriculture in 700 were far more technologically advanced than the first literate civilizations of 3000 BC or so. But before our age, back in the pre-industrial agrarian age, technological progress led to little visible change over one or even several lifetimes, and little growth in typical living standards, even across centuries or millennia. Recall my crude index that tracks the value of humanity's useful ideas about manipulating nature and organizing collective efforts? To calculate it, assume that each 1% increase in typical human living standards worldwide, that tells us the value of our useful ideas has risen by 1%. And that's simply a normalization. I want the index to scale with real income and not with something else, like the square root of or the square of income. And also assume that each 1% increase in the human population at a constant typical living standard tells us the value of useful ideas has increased by 0.5%. That in the face of a 1% increase in population, you need a 0.5% improvement in technology to hold living standards constant because of resource scarcity. That's a way of taking account of the fact that since natural resources are not unlimited, we depend on added human ingenuity to support a larger population at the same living standard. set this quantitative index equal to a value of 1 in 1870 at the start of the long 20th century. Back in the year minus 8,000, when we discovered agriculture and developed herding, the index stood at 0.04. It would take 25 workers in minus 8,000 to do what one worker could do in 1870. By the year 1, this index was 0.25. With the same resources, better technologies meant that the typical worker in year 1 was more than 6 times as productive as the typical worker had been back at the beginning of the agrarian age. By the year 1500, the index stood at 0.43. Now, these are truly impressive changes in an index number. They summarize truly miraculous and impressive enlargements of the human empire. The technologies of 1500, the Ming pottery or the Portuguese caravel or the wet cultivation of rice seedlings, would have seemed miraculous. But this growth and this pace of invention took place over an enormous span of time. Technology crawled ahead at only 0.036% per year for the entire period between 1 and 1500. That's only 0.9% over an average 25-year human lifespan of that age. And did greater knowledge about technology and human organization, did those miraculous technologies cause life in 1500 to be much sweeter than it had been in minus 8,000? It turns out not. The human population grew at an average of 0.7% per year from the year 1 to 1500. And this 0.07% per year decrease in average farm sizes and other available natural resources per worker meant that more skillful work produced little, if any, additional net product. While the elite lived far better in 1500, typical human peasants and craftsmen lived little or not. Miraculous technologies improved living standards and led to more fertility because of better health and a higher population, which led to greater resource scarcity, which pushed living standards back down. And all in a while, predation is a drag on entrepreneurship. Specializing in making more stuff rather than in figuring out how to be a thug with a spear, and you find yourself a soft target. And if predation is a focus of energy, of elite energy, of the energy of those who are deciding what society is going to spend its resources on, if predation rather than production and technological improvement is the focus of energy, it should not be any surprise that the rate of technological progress was extremely, extremely slow. Thus, agrarian age humans were desperately poor, a near subsistence level society. On average, 2.03 children per mother survived to reproduce. 1 in 7 of mothers died in childbed. In addition, 1 in 5 more died before menopause. But for those who managed to reach menopause, in order to produce 2.03 children surviving to reproduce, counting mothers who die before they reach menopause, we're talking 9 pregnancies and 6 live births and maybe 3 children surviving to age 10. Breastfeeding for 3 years or so. That means perhaps 20 years eating for 2. Keeping your children from dying is the first and highest goal of every parent. Humanity in the agrarian age could not do so. That tells us how much pressure from material want humanity found itself under. Now, over the millennia, we did have 1.5% population growth per generation to offset the benefits of better technology. That added up. In 1500, there were about 3 times as many people as had lived in year 1. 500 million rather than 170 million. But these additional humans did not translate to less individual material want in any sense. Rather, before 1500, advances in technology and organizational knowledge, would almost entirely to compensate for fewer available natural resources per worker. Thus, economic history remained a slowly changing background in front of which cultural, political, and social history took place. But the ice started to break after 1500. Maybe ice breaking isn't the best metaphor. Perhaps a better metaphor is crossing a mountain divide and entering into a new watershed. You are now going downhill and things are flowing in a new direction. Call the shift that took about in the coming in 1500, the coming of the age of the imperial commercial revolution. The pace of inventions and innovations sped up. And then around 1770, we crossed into yet a different watershed, as far as the level of worldwide prosperity and the pace of economic growth was concerned. Call the century after 1770 the Industrial Revolution age. And indeed, by 1870, the index of the value of knowledge stood at 1, more than twice as large as it had been in 1500. It had taken 9,500 years to get the tenfold jump in knowledge from 0.04 to 0.43, an average time to double of some 2,800 years. But then the next doubling took less than 370 years, some 320, say. But did that mean a richer, more comfortable humanity? No, by and large not. Yes, a richer, more comfortable elite, perhaps. But there were then, in 1870, 1.3 billion people alive, 2.6 times as many as there'd been in 1500. Farm sizes only 2/5 as large on average as they'd been in 1500. They canceled the overwhelming bulk of technological improvement as far as typical human living standards were concerned. Then around 1870, it was in 1870 that we crossed over into what Simon Kuznets called modern economic growth. During the period that followed, during the long 20th century, there came an explosion. Then there was a big enchilada. The approximately 7.5 billion people alive in 2010, they had an average global of knowledge index of 21.5, and paused to marvel at that. A 34-year doubling time in our technological knowledge after 1870. And indeed, by 2010, the typical human family no longer faced as its most urgent task the important problem of acquiring enough food, clothing, and shelter to kind of keep things together. And people could be confident that they wouldn't suddenly lack food, clothing, and shelter next week, or next year, or even next week. The keys to this after 1870 are the coming of the Industrial Research Lab, the corporation, and of globalization. That those on top of modern science, on top of the market economy, on top of limited government and confidence, or at least some confidence that your property would stay yours, those did miracles. Those committed absolute miracles. After 1870, from the techno-economic point of view, 1870 to 2010 was the age of the Industrial Research Lab, the bureaucratic corporations, and globalization. One gathered communities of engineering practice to supercharge economic growth. The second organized communities of competence to deploy the fruits of invention. And globalization, cheap ocean and rail transport that destroyed distance as a cost factor, those allowed humans in enormous numbers to seek better lives, allowed us to talk about the world in real time, and allowed corporations to achieve great improvements in productivity by scale. The lab, the corporation, and globalization powered the wave of discovery, invention, innovation, deployment, and then global economic integration, are the things that have so boosted our global useful knowledge index by so much. From the biosociological point of view, this long 20th century material progress meant that the typical woman today no longer needs to spend 20 years eating for two, pregnant or breastfeeding, simply to keep the population from falling. Today it's much like 4 years. And it's also during this period for the first time that we're no longer in the case where half our babies die in miscarriages, stillbirths, and infancy. And we no longer lose 1 in 7 mothers to childbed. From the national political point of view, the wealth creation and distribution drove 4 things. First, 1870 to 2010 was the century when the United States of America became a superpower, became a hyperpower. But it was also the period the world came to be comprised primarily of nations rather than empires. And the economy's center of gravity began to become oligopolistic firms ringmastering value chains that spanned across nations. And last, political orders became primarily legitimated, at least notionally, by elections with universal suffrage, rather than the claims of plutocracy, tradition, fitness, leadership charisma, or knowledge of a secret key to historical destiny. Now, much that our predecessors would have called utopia has indeed been attained step by step via improvements each year, each of which is marginal but which compounds. And indeed, as of 1870, such an explosion was not foreseen by anybody, even though by the last quarter of the 19th century, a leading economy, a Briton, a Belgian, an American, and Australian, had perhaps twice the material wealth and standard of living of the typical inhabitant of a pre-industrial economy. But everything that had happened up to 1870, it was not a true watershed crossing. It's back in the 1870s. John Stuart Mill put the finishing touches on the final edition of the book that people then seeking to understand economics looked to. His Principles of Political Economy with some of their applications to social philosophy. His book gave due attention and place to the 1730-1870 era of the British Industrial Revolution. But he looked out on what he saw around him and saw the world still poor and miserable. Far from lightening humanity's daily toil, the era's technology merely, quote, enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment, and enabled an increased number of manufacturers and others to make fortunes, unquote. Oh, and it also meant there was a larger middle class. Now, one word of Mill's stands out to me. Imprisonment. Mill saw the world of 1870 as not just a world of drudgery, but as a world in which people were in jail, imprisoned, as if they were in a dungeon, chained and fettered. And there were others who were much more pessimistic than Mill. In 1865, then 30-year economist William Stanley Jevons made his reputation by prophesying doom for the British economy. It needed to immediately cut back on industrial production to economize on scarce and increasingly valuable coal. With such pessimism circulating, the coming explosion in economic growth was far from expected. And those who did expect it, they were apt, to misconstrue it. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Here we have them, Engels on the left, Marx in the middle, Marx's future wife Jenny von Westphalen to the right. They had in 1848 already seen science and technology as Promethean forces that would allow humanity to overthrow its mythical old gods and give humanity itself the powers of gods. Science, technology, and the profit-seeking entrepreneurial business class that deployed it had, they said, during its rule of scarce 100 years, created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have had all preceding generations together. Engels snarked that in their overlooking the power of science, technology, and engineering, me economists like Mill had demonstrated they were simply the paid hacks of the rich. But Marx and Engels' promise was not that there'd someday be an exponential increase in the value of global knowledge and of productivity, or even an unlimited choice of music to listen to. In Marx's view, that wealth would get us to utopia. In Marx's few and thin descriptions of life after the socialist revolution, in works like his critique of the Gotha program, the utopian life he foresaw echoes, deliberately, the descriptions given in the Acts of the Apostles about how people who have attained the kingdom of heaven behave. Now, that's not where we are, and that's not where we could expect to be. However, economic improvement attained by slouch or gallop really does matter. Increasingly, we push forward the body of technological and scientific knowledge. We educate each other, we doctor and nurse each other, we care for our young and we're old, we entertain each other, we provide other services to each other. We engage in complicated symbolic interactions that have the emergent effect of distributing status and power and coordinating the division of labor of today's economy. And we use the technologies we've developed to transform nature in utterly complete and marvelous ways. We have crossed a great divide between what we used to do in all previous human history in the realm of necessity and what we do now, at least potentially, in the realm of freedom. Utopia, this is not. Thus I imagine Edward Bellamy would be at once both depressed and impressed and disappointed and to some degree elated. Economic historian Richard Easterlin has a take on all of this, that we're simply ill-suited for utopia. With our increasing wealth, what used to be necessities become matters of little concern, perhaps even beneath our notice. But conveniences turn into necessities, and we feel their lack enormously. Luxuries turn into conveniences, and we humans envision and then create new luxuries. Easterlin is bemused over how, quote, material concerns in the wealthiest nations today are as pressing as ever, and the pursuit of material needs as intense, as generation after generation thinks it needs only another 10 or 20% more income to be perfectly happy. And in the end, the triumph of economic growth is not a triumph of humanity over material wants, rather it is a triumph of material desires over humanity, unquote. We don't use our wealth to overmaster our wants, rather our wants use our wealth to overmaster us. And this hedonic treadmill is one very powerful reason why, even when all went well, we either slouched rather than galloped toward utopia. Nevertheless, getting off the treadmill looks grim. Only a fool would wittingly or ignorantly slouch or gallop backwards. Or even in a world where lots of people still look poor, wish to stand still.